you hear people say this, and you find YouTube videos for this, and there's all sorts of content online and social media things where people say, I'm off to the woods this weekend to do survival camping. You could just knock the word survival out of that and say, I'm going to the woods this weekend to go camping. Because the definition of bushcraft has changed. As much as I'd like it to have not done, it has changed, and I can't really avoid that. That is not the definition that you will get now if you search hashtag bushcraft on Instagram or TikTok or something like that. So it is the craft of how you live in the bush, in the wilderness areas. And it's not, these are the things that you make to live in those places. This is the craft that you need to have in your brain, in the muscle memory in your body, in your choice of equipment, in your choice of route, and all of these other things, in your decision-making dynamic. This is the craft you need to have. So you need to, if you want to live in these areas and thrive in them and be able to work with these landscapes, work with nature in these places, you need to have this craft. Those are the skills of our ancestors, or someone's ancestor, using simpler systems, simpler structures, and by structure I mean societal structures. You haven't got a factory doing halfway through a supply chain with raw material mining at one end, and then a factory, and then a national distribution hub, and then a retailer, and then you buy that thing to use it to do that thing. That's not primitive because you've got all that stuff behind it.
Ready?
Yep.
Dave from Missouri asks, what is the difference between survival, camping, bushcraft and primitive skills?
Is that Missouri like America?
I think so.
There's not a Missouri, Northamptonshire or something that I've missed.
Not that I've heard of.
Okay. It's a really interesting one because the answer isn't a direct answer to what you've asked. So, if you could break it down, the difference between camping and survival, I think, is intention. So that you intend to go camping. You don't intend to go surviving. You don't intend to go breathing. You hear people say this, and you find YouTube videos for this, and there's all sorts of content online and social media things where people say, I'm off to the woods this weekend to do survival camping. You could just knock the word survival out of that and say, I'm going to the woods this weekend to go camping, because you're going there with the intent of sleeping out in a tent or under a tarp or in a hammock or under a leaf litter shelter, or sleeping out in the woods somewhere away from a house, away from sort of the structure of civilization. That's what camping is. The fact that you're doing it with fewer items, or you're doing it more uncomfortably, or with fewer resources, doesn't really change the fact that it's still camping. That's not to negate it, that's not to put it down, because I've made my life and my career effectively from doing stuff like that. But people get this idea that because it's camping, therefore it's campsite and a little bit of luxury, and the toilets are just over there, and there's a clean water coming out of a tap over there. But that's just a venue for it. That's just one way of doing it. If you're sleeping in a bivvy bag on the side of a mountain somewhere in Scotland, or you're in a tent in the death zone on Everest, you're still camping. It's still a way of living. It's a way of getting that overnight rest aspect into what you're doing. So survival isn't something you intend to go out and do any more than any of you listening are surviving by just breathing in and out. Now, if you're not dead, you're surviving, because just by the definition of that word. So survival isn't something, in the context of people talk about it, survival training, a survival situation. It's not something you intend to go out and do. It's a situation you find yourself in. We have that whole podcast, Modern Outdoor Survival, which talks about this, which talks about that good survival training isn't about having exactly the right things in your pockets and this thing and this tool on your wrist and then waiting for disaster to happen. It's about having good training, making good decisions at the right times, making the best decisions you can before you go and do the thing, making good decisions while you're doing the thing. That's what survival training is. But a survival situation generally is something that it's not something you intended to do, it's something you found yourself in. Your car loses grip on a wet country road in the middle of the night and you find yourself now having to correct and steer into the skid. That's sort of a survival situation. And if you know how to do that, you steer into the skid and you apply power or braking at the right moments, then you can recover that situation. But that's a mini survival situation. Just in the same way that if you're light aircraft on flying through the backcountry in Alaska or Canada, if that develops engine trouble and you've got to put down somewhere, well, that's going to probably put you in a survival situation as well. So that intention, I think, is the difference between camping and survival. So if you're watching this and that's how you define what you do, you go out and sleep in the woods under a shelter made from improvised shelter made from natural materials, or under a big tarp canopy like we have here, or you're in a camp like this one, it's still camping, but that doesn't mean that one is greater than the other. It's not survival is tougher and that's what real men do. It's no, if you're sleeping in a tent on the ice sheets in Antarctica, that's still camping. It doesn't reduce the toughness of it by calling it camping. It's okay to call things camping. Every time I've slept out intentionally, I was camping, no matter where I was in the world. Survival is the thing that you find yourself in accidentally. You don't go out intending to end up in a survival situation, or at least I hope you don't. Bushcraft that's the tricky thing, because the definition of bushcraft has changed. As much as I'd like it to have not done, it has changed, and I can't really avoid that. What I grew up in the 80s and 90s understanding of that word, more so the 90s, and then in the early 2000s decided to become an outdoor instructor and become a mountain leader and did all those other things. And what I did then, and that word bushcraft that was attached to some of those things, that is not the definition that I had in my mind then and other people had in their minds then. That is not the definition that you will get now if you search hashtag bushcraft on Instagram or TikTok or something like that. What you'll probably find is people building stuff in the woods. And I think the problem for that lies, well, it's a combination, the reason for that is a combination of the internet and foreigners. And the internet, because that is how most people get a lot of their information these days, whether they want to or not. It's how we communicate, through social media, through emails, through websites, WhatsApp. We are using the internet to connect with people on the other side of the world, including people in Missouri who send me in weird questions. That information stream, that information network has skewed definitions, because people want to make content, particularly for social media, but for websites as well. People want to make content that matches the broadest definition of the term. So if you want to make content about woodworking, then you would make lots of videos about the broadest definitions of woodworking. But if you wanted to say, right, we're going to make a video about woodworking, and you only did marquetry, you only did that little that thing where you inlay tiny pieces of veneer in very intricate patterns on fine furniture, that would knock out the vast majority of what people would call woodworking around the world. So generalization is how information is spread across the internet. You can find niches, you can go down rabbit holes of chasing one particular subject, and you can find a lot of information, but at the top level, you're looking at very, 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 very general terms. And I say foreigners because this is hopefully going to avoid a YouTube strike, I'm talking about language. I'm talking about English language versus every other language on earth. Because English generally is the language of internet traffic. Most apps, most big apps, most platforms will automatically translate other languages into English for you. Browsers and YouTube and things like that will all have a button, translate this tweet, translate this video, and they'll put it out into an AI, an artificial intelligence understanding of what it thinks the language is that's being spoken or written, and the language that you want it to be. It's never perfect. Anyone who's ever tried to translate stuff from English into another language that you already know, like I'm trying to translate stuff from English into Welsh or Welsh into English, it's 95% accurate, sometimes 90, but every now and again you come across this one word that throws the whole thing out. I think that's what's happened with Bushcraft, where automatic translations of things have taken a word that was mostly from the English-speaking world. So bush, it's an old Boer word, and I'm going to get people commenting now because I've mispronounced Boer. Dutch people in South Africa, before it was South Africa. It's a bastardization of their word for the woods, the backcountry, wilderness, bush. And then kind of in parallel you have the Antipodean countries, you have Australia and New Zealand, both referring to their backcountry as the bush. The Australian bush and the Kiwis, New Zealanders call their forested areas and their backcountry the bush as well. And then you have the similar thing in Canada, and you have the bush there, particularly on the English-speaking side of it and the non-French side of it. And between those three places, you've got the word bushcraft that comes from there. So it is the craft of how you live in the bush, in the wilderness areas. And it's not, oh yeah, these are the things that you make to live in those places. This is the craft that you need to have in your brain, in the muscle memory in your body, in your choice of equipment, in your choice of route, in all of these other things, in your decision-making dynamic. This is the craft you need to have. So you need to, if you want to live in these areas and thrive in them and be able to work with these landscapes, work with nature in these places, you need to have this craft. It's craft as in tradecraft, as in fieldcraft, as in a good sense, as in common sense. You know, it's that kind of craft. It's not building things from your hand. It's not that kind of craft. It's not like handicraft. So that's what bushcraft was. It was the skills required to live in these wilderness backcountry areas, and that wasn't particular to building any one particular thing. But then social media came and automatic translation came about, and effectively you weren't dealing with the English-speaking audience if you were writing a book about bushcraft or writing a blog post or something. You were dealing with everyone on earth, which is just kind of the nature of the modern world. But that translation takes bushcraft and goes, well, what's bush? Bush is wilderness. What's craft? Craft is building. Oh, it's building stuff in the wilderness. Boop. And that's what you end up with. And that's basically what bushcraft has become for the majority of the world now. It's people building huts, people building forts, people building structures and really elaborate camps and all these other things in the woods, in what they are calling wilderness areas. Although for some of those, you turn the camera 10 or 15 degrees either way and you find out it's not a wilderness area, it's just the woods at the edge of a field somewhere. We're not in a wilderness area now, we're at the farm camp. If you've seen our other videos, this is just the farm camp. There's a road there, there's a road there, there's a house there, there's a house there, there's a house over there. We're in the middle of a farm. This is not a wilderness area. But I could build something over here and say I'm in a wilderness area, I'm in a wilderness camp. So that internet-driven way of communicating internationally has changed that definition of bushcraft. So when you ask what is the difference between camping, survival, bushcraft and primitive skills, well, Camping is sleeping outside of a building intentionally. Survival is the situation that you end up in accidentally and you are trying to not die in. And bushcraft, well, that's the knowledge, or it should be, that is the knowledge of how to live and thrive in wilderness-like environments. Well, that's how I define it. The problem is the rest of the world seems to be defining it as building forts. It's bushcraft camping. Why is it bushcraft camping? Because we've put 3 sticks together and stapled some leaves to it. That's building a crap hut. That's for YouTube likes, that's not bushcraft. So it sounds like I'm being down on it and being very negative about it. It's that with these terms, you have to not only understand what the original intention was, but also how it is perceived by the rest of the world. Because if you're consuming a wide range of content, and as I said, that internet's at a general level, then you have to understand what everyone else's intention is when they're making that content. What do they think they're producing? What do they think they're creating? So when you're consuming their content, and you're consuming this content, if you consume, you're watching this video, if you've watched this far, you're consuming it. What was my intention when making this? My intention was to answer this audience question. We do these videos periodically, and I answer what Amy, our producer, thinks are the good questions. So think about both the definition of what I might think it is, but also, and you might think it is, but what the rest of the world think it is as well. Because if you go into Google and type bushcraft, you're not getting my definition or your definition alone, you're getting the rest of the world's definition. And nowadays, the algorithm's definition. If you're wanting to make a living and make a life from making content on the internet, on Instagram or YouTube or TikTok or wherever you're making content, and you're trying to monetize it and get paid, and fair play to you, then you're going to have more success if you do what that computer algorithm wants, not what you think is true to your definition. So bushcraft is a very difficult one now to nail down, but I think, and I have always thought, it is the skills for living and thriving in the bush, as in wilderness backcountry environments, whether that be navigating with a map and compass, navigating by using the shape of the trees here, or by the way that bit of moisture on that side of the track is drying relative to that bit of moisture, those kind of things, whether it's foraging, whether it's hunting, whether it's paddling a canoe, whether even if that's a fiberglass canoe or a plastic canoe, a Royal X or something, or a birch bark canoe, it's still all bushcraft. It's this huge world because it is the skills that are required to do your thing in that wilderness environment. Although I will say that at every level, that involves an interaction with nature. Maybe I should add that on as a layer, because you could just go in a tent and have your rucksack with fuel and food and a stove and a tent and sleeping bag and water and everything, and go and camp in a supermarket car park. That's still camping. But if you were to come up into, the woods on the top of the mountains over here, or hills, if you were to go and camp there and live there for 2 weeks with that same rucksack, you're probably going to have to get more food or get more water or fuel or use some natural materials, which means you are going to have to interact with nature and become interdependent with nature as part of that. So, Dave, camping is intentionally going out to sleep out outside of a building, whether it's on a campsite, whether it's on Everest. It's all camping. Survival, you could end up in a survival situation at home or in a city or on the road somewhere. It's something that it's an emergency situation that you didn't intend to be in. Then you have bushcraft, which is the skills and the mindset required to live and thrive in wilderness or wilderness-like environments. And primitive skills. Well, primitive skills are, for my definition, they are the skills of our ancestors. They are the skills that I wouldn't put a cap on the Stone Age and the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of using metal tools, but when you think about the timeline of our species and say we've been around as humans on this planet for 350,000 years. Well, if that's that timeline there, then that's the bit where we've had modern tools right there. That's our ancestors. That's 350,000 years ago. That's now. That's the bit where we've had metal tools. Tiny bit right at the very end. So when you say primitive skills, primitive does not mean worse. Primitive does not mean not good enough. Primitive means a simpler technology. It's still technology, but it's just simpler. So it's you could class it as pre-industrial, but even that only takes us back 240 years, 250 years, depending on where you're defining that. So were our medieval ancestors, were they practicing primitive skills? Well, if you were living in a city and you were living in a stone building or a wooden building there and everything was being brought to you and you were a merchant and you were trading across Europe, then you probably wouldn't think of your life as being very primitive. But if you were a woodcutter working out in the middle of the forest somewhere in the centre of England or in Wales here or up in Scotland there, or you were a crofter, then your life by comparison would have been fairly primitive. So you could define primitive skills by comparison. You could define it by, is this primitive compared to that? Is it a simpler way of doing things? Is it you're maybe fulfilling only the basic needs of food, shelter, water, health, human companionship, all those things in a very simple way compared to doing it in a very structured, hierarchical way, involving hundreds if not thousands of people. So primitive skills on a very broad level, and I always like broad levels, I like concepts rather than fixed ideas. I would say it is the skills that existed before a very complicated structure of doing things. And if you think about clothing and equipment now, well, these aren't primitive because who makes this? Helicon makes that. In order for this company to exist, to make this product, and I don't know, are these made in China, Far East somewhere, I don't know. But it's a Polish brand. So for Poland to exist and China to exist as countries, as sovereign states, then there's a lot of structure that has to be there, and a structure that has to be there in order for there to be international trade, and for there to be systems in place to pay for it, and for me to pay for it, and to get it here, and for legal frameworks for this to exist as a company in its own right. And that's just one brand. There's all the other brands I'm wearing. Whereas you compare that to this hat, which Amy made. So this is a hat that's knitted, hand knitted. Is it acrylic? Yeah, it's like an acrylic blend wool thing. So it's not full on wool, but it is wool like, and this is hand knitted. This, I would say, is more primitive than this, because this started off as a ball of synthetic-ish wool, but it was knitted together by hand with very simple tools. So if we downgraded from this and got some wool from those sheep over there in that field, and Amy had carded the wool and spun the wool, and what else do you do to wool? That's bad. Yeah. So yeah, processing wool from short fibres in clumps as on the fleece of a sheep to long thin fibres, long thin spun fibres that then you can knit together in the same way. Is that a primitive skill? It's an ancestral skill. You know, people have been knitting and has been around for about 10 minutes after we worked out what we could do with wool, I think. And felting is an even more primitive way of doing that. So, but both of them require a less of a structure, less of a social structure, less of a resource structure around them, because with two sharpened sticks and that sheep over there, Amy can make me another hat. So is that a primitive skill? I'm guessing when you asked this, you were thinking of those channels where people, often in loincloths for reasons, are making really elaborate huts, really elaborate structures, those shelters that have steps that go down into them, and a swimming pool, and heated this and heated that. And there's the guy in Australia, the Primitive Skills Australia, Primitive if you're watching this, you probably know who I mean, who makes amazing things, and it shows you every single step. And if you click the subtitles, then it explains, because he doesn't speak in the videos, but he explains what's going on. Fantastic skills. Making really elaborate things in a way that would be recognisable to First Nations people, to Indigenous people in similar climates around that strip of the earth. And you could do the same thing for stuff in the UK, because people have been living here for tens of thousands of years doing different things. There's a hill fort up there on top of the hill, made of stone, and it was basically made of stone and logs. Is that a primitive skill? If you're comparing it to the house I live in, yeah, it is a primitive one. But compared that to the mud hut that was just outside the walls, well, that was probably quite a fancy structure. If you're using primitive skills as being defined by what you see on the internet, because it's someone doing something in a way that would be recognizable to someone's ancestor, then yeah, I think that's a good definition of primitive skills in its own. It's something that's doing things in a way that is more traditional, that is using fewer resources or more local resources, using fewer tools, using less of a structure behind it to make a thing or achieve a thing or find food or hunt or whatever it might be. Because you can have primitive hunting skills and primitive navigation skills, primitive cooking skills, because our ancestors were doing this for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So there is no one definition of primitive skills beyond just a very simple traditional way of doing something that uses resources that maybe are found locally but do not require a massive structure to bring them all together. I really didn't expect this answer to take that long, but I think I went off on a bit of a rant there. To tidy it all up, camping, sleeping out of doors intentionally, using, well, just out of doors, and that's it. Really, it's a very simple definition. Survival being the thing that you didn't intend, it's a situation you didn't intend to get yourself in, but it's the one you have found yourself in, and now you need to do something about it in order to die. Because you can fail at survival. Lots of people manage that. Bushcraft, the skills to live in a wilderness or wilderness-like environment, or to work in those environments and to thrive there. And primitive skills, well, those are the skills of our ancestors or someone's ancestor, using simpler systems, simpler structures, and by structure I mean societal structures. You haven't got a factory doing halfway through a supply chain with raw material mining at one end, and then a factory, and then a national distribution hub, and then a retailer, and then you buy that thing to use it to do that thing. That's not primitive, because you've got all that stuff behind it. So those are my definitions of those four things. So if you've managed to keep watching through all of this, well done. I do have a habit of going off like this and just ranting on, but they are quite thick concepts. They're not very, very simple things that can be covered in 75 words in a paragraph. Or if you do cover it in that kind of very, very short description without any of the backstory to it, I think you end up with an overly simplified version of that definition, but doesn't really mean anything. So I hope that helped. I hope that answered your question, Dave. And if you have any others, then please send them in. There's contact details below this video. There's our social media there. You can leave them in the comments. We'll try and answer them as best we can. Thank you.